What exactly is Nazi ideology? And should espousing or supporting Nazi ideology result in a prison sentence? That's become rather the issue recently, with Premier Chris Minns in New South Wales moving to criminalise the display of support for Nazi ideology, especially around Jewish places of worship. This could result in a prison sentence of up to 2 years and hefty fines of up to $22,000. So let's dig into it, and you can let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. Now, the catalyst for this whole situation was a protest outside New South Wales Parliament House, where a relatively small group of National Socialist Network individuals protested. They were all clad in black and protested their disdain for the Jewish lobby, whatever that happens to mean. Regardless, this was rather embarrassing for the Premier, rather embarrassing for the police, and rather embarrassing for New South Wales Parliament. Because this protest was in fact entirely legal. The National Socialist Network apparently did nothing illegal by doing this protest, and therefore people had egg on their face. They were left with the media questioning them. How could this happen? How is it that people who were associated with what looks like a neo-Nazi organization, how were they able to protest so publicly, and indeed so legally? And how was the protest allowed to go ahead? Now, of course, the federal government didn't look kindly on this, moving swiftly to cancel the visa of a South African person who had participated in the protest. But now, the New South Wales government has gone even further. They decided to criminalise such protests, or at least implicitly do so by criminalising the display of support for Nazi ideology. They've moved forward a bill on the 19th of November to do just this. Now, of course, we need to dig into this bill to look exactly at what it does. And in essence, there's a couple of portions to this bill. The first of it is displaying Nazi symbols or doing public acts along those lines that would display support for Nazi ideology. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. For example, if it's part of a historical documentary, for example, or part of a movie, that type of thing. But if it's someone who is doing this as actually a display of a Nazi symbol, then that can result in imprisonment of up to 2 years, depending on where it is done. Now, doing this outside of a Jewish museum or a place of worship is more criminalized than doing it just in the general public. If they do it in the general public, there's a prison sentence of up to 12 months. If they do it outside of a Jewish organization or a Jewish place of worship, then it's up to 2 years in prison. Now, that was already punished, and I do have some misgivings about this. I'm not entirely sure that words should result in a prison sentence of up to a year, or potentially up to 2 years. And even if those words or those symbols happen to be disliked by everyone else, should there be such a hefty prison sentence? Should prison sentences of that nature be focused on acts such as burglary or violent acts, rather than saying words or displaying symbols? And indeed, which symbols should be criminalized in this manner? For example, we can all agree that the Nazi organization was violent and resulted in significant negative outcomes. And indeed, I rather dislike them because they are control freaks. They're socialist control freaks and they're racist. And therefore, I have no sympathy for the Nazi organizations. But that is a separate issue from whether I think that displaying a Nazi symbol should result in a prison sentence of 12 months. Furthermore, should displaying a symbol of a known and classified terrorist organization such as Hezbollah, should that also result in a similar sentence? One would think that it should, simply out of consistency. However, the real sticking point here is the new part of the bill, which says, a person commits an offence if the person knowingly engages in conduct by public act or without a reasonable excuse on or near a Jewish place that indicates support for Nazi ideology, by invoking imagery or characteristics that a reasonable person would consider to be associated with Nazi ideology. And the conduct would cause a reasonable person to fear harassment, intimidation, or violence, or fear for the person's safety. That particular section pertains to doing it at a Jewish place. However, there's a slightly lesser offence for doing it just in the general public. Now, of course, Mark Latham, whose policies I often disagree with, decided to leap upon this And to do this, he read aloud a passage from a book. The passage was about the reduction and failure of small business, ostensibly through government policy. That passage, it turned out, came from Mein Kampf. Now, of course, Mark Latham's point was that a book like Mein Kampf, which encompasses Nazi ideology, has a whole lot of aspects that are core Nazi beliefs, so for example anti-Semitism, but a whole lot of other aspects that are not encompassed by anti-Semitism. His point was that many things go into Nazi ideology. Indeed, socialism was core to Nazi ideology. One could also argue, therefore, that espousing socialism should also run afoul of this law, because that was core, like I said, to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The real issue is how you define ideology, because the ideology has many core parts of belief to it. The rule and the legislation is so vague it could capture a lot of types of conduct. Now, of course, the subsection about fearing harassment, intimidation, or violence, or fearing for the person's safety, well, of course, that does create a bit of a bulwark on it. But I dare say if someone is reading out loud from Mein Kampf in public, then maybe they'd be able to make that out. Depends on exactly how that comes up at court, and it hasn't yet been tested. Now, clearly a politician reading from Mein Kampf to make the political point he was making would not cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety, but we can see that there's a grey area here. Now, of course, other parts of the bill would come in and protect conduct such as Mark Latham's. For example, in subsection 6, it says, without limiting the foregoing parts of the legislation, a reasonable excuse for having displayed that Nazi symbol or conducted oneself could be for academic or artistic or educational purposes, or for another purpose in the public interest. For example, Mark Latham making a political point, such as the one he was making, could be argued to be in the public interest, because he was making a point about the vagueness of terms such as ideology, and therefore the problem with vague laws. One would argue that is in the public interest, because it is indeed a very good point. Laws should not be cast so widely they could cast up a lot of different types of conduct. But I think there's a broader point. How do we choose which ideologies are going to be criminalized in this type of way? We've got Nazi ideology being criminalized, but what about communism as it was practiced in Russia back in the 1900s? When the communists took over, they threw vast numbers of people into the furnace. They literally murdered many millions of people. The Nazis murdered millions of people, and that was wrong, and the communists in Russia also murdered millions of people, and that was also wrong. But it appears that one is being prohibited here, and the other appears to be able to run rampant. But of course, the broader point here is which ideologies are banned and which ones are not. Which ideologies can result in a prison sentence and which ones do not. Supporting which terrorist organizations should be criminal and which ones are not criminal. Why is it that violent far-left beliefs are not met with the same opprobrium as violent, supposedly far-right beliefs? And I personally believe that Nazis are indeed far-left. They are, after all, socialist control freaks. They are a far-left organization that just happens to have been called far-right, which I do find a little bit ironic, because as a tangent, libertarians are somehow far-right, but also so are Nazis. I'm not totally sure how that is compatible, because the two are so diametrically opposed ideologically that they are not part of the same equation. Nevertheless, the point stands that we've got a degree of inconsistency. And in addition to that, we have the issue of, should we be imprisoning people for holding and espousing an ideology? And would that just radicalize them further? Or are there better approaches to tackle this type of situation than a prison sentence? You can let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below, of course.